All right, hello and welcome. My name is Duncan Davidson. I am in Berlin right now, and of course, streaming out to the world live from my home office, which is such an interesting experience. I'm joined today by Sarah Novotny, and we're going to have a little discussion about open source and startups and the intersection between the two. We titled this session "Courage and Culture." Being brave, and we hope that we can bring some courage to this, along with all the other aspects that we need during this time, including resilience. So let me bring Sarah on and ask her to introduce herself. Who are you, Sarah, and what's your background?
Hi, so yes, I am Sarah Novotny, and I have a varied background, which makes, I think, some of these conversations very interesting. I have worked at Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, and I have also worked at a number of startups over the period of time, including building my own and bootstrapping my own startup for 10 years back in the early 2000s. So my background and focus, though, for the last 15 years has been open source software more specifically, and how that work happens within the industry and across industry on very large scale projects. So when I was at Google, I led the conversion of the Kubernetes project from a company-led project to a community-led project, as well as helping found the Cloud Native Computing Foundation and getting the Kubernetes project moved into that foundation. My background also includes a bunch of work on governance across a lot of different projects and open source foundations.
So I have to say real quick, thank you for all of your hard work on the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, the Kubernetes Foundation, all of those pieces, moving those out of from the big company into the open source world. I can relate a little bit to how much of a journey that was, because 20 years ago or something, I went through not nearly as big a process, but a similar process where we took Tomcat and Ant from Sun into open source. And those were, I remember a lot of meetings with lawyers, and I remember a lot of deep conversations. And so I can only imagine in this day and age how much bigger that was for Kubernetes and the rest of it. So given that you've worked at so many different places, both at the intersection of the companies and or the corporates and open source, what did you find interesting about Microsoft and open source right now? Specifically, you just joined us not too long ago in the company. What was it that led you to think, maybe this is a good idea?
Well, Microsoft is fascinating to me. I actually lived in Seattle for 20 years while I was working at Amazon and many of the startups. But when I went to Google, I went and moved to the Bay Area, as one does. And during my 20 years in Seattle, I avoided working for Microsoft, which is a really interesting thing to say at the moment. I watched the culture. The people that I knew that worked there weren't very happy. Those that were happy were not necessarily the people I wanted to spend a lot of time with, etc. So when Microsoft started making forays into open source, I was always a bit skeptical. I've been working with varying Microsofties when in open source for more than 10 years. And, first there was the have open source, sort of ring fenced in its own corporation variation of open source with Microsoft. And now with Satya coming on board and making such, or not coming on board, but moving to the CEO position and making such a huge cultural shift for the company, which included moving into and being more open to open source software, or continuing that path and pushing it even further, I started watching a lot more closely. And I know that a lot of open source wonks, as I want to call myself, have been moving and watching that move with skepticism and then with hope. And now, actually, at this point, in a lot of cases, with great reverence and appreciation for the change that Microsoft has brought. And so it was really tough when Microsoft came and said, hey, let's start talking about maybe a position here. It's hard to say no to a company that is really moving intentionally into your preferred technology space, and the possibility of helping Microsoft continue to deepen their understanding of open source culture and to be able to represent, authentically and wholly on stages somewhere, a company that is trying to learn and trying to grow from its engagement with the open source community is a really tough sell to resist.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. I mean, I too was once a never Microsofter. And to borrow a little lingo from the times, and yeah, now it's amazing what the company's doing and what's happening here. So let's dig a little bit into the connection between open source and startups. What do you see as the importance of open source to startups?
Well, I see a lot of the open source to startups as very similar to the value that enterprises get, which is first and foremost a building block. So much of our world is built on shared open source libraries or shared open source infrastructure or shared open source, composition units is probably the way to best describe it. And we are in a place now, in the adolescence of our industry, where we have a lot of common patterns and a lot of common patterns that aren't necessarily held private at this point. Because if you look at standards bodies of the 80s and 90s in technology, a bunch of big companies got together, agreed on a standard, and then went and wrote their own proprietary, fully integrated, vertically contained solution that they then sold to their customers. Whereas 20 years on, small and large companies, startups and enterprises, have many, many more opinions about the technology that they're going to use. And that those opinions mean that any vendor trying to talk to them needs to understand their point of view and be able to compose with these different components. So you no longer have a Microsoft stack from, you start with your Cisco networking layer and then have Microsoft stacked on top of all of that. So open source is the composition pieces in so many cases that both vendors and startups and big companies and small companies have to use to put together the solution that fits their bespoke needs.
Right. No, it's been so long since I've thought about the standards.
I know.
Not the wars, not the battles, but when people are talking about let's do POSIX, let's do all these things in order to make Unix standard, and then that worked out so well.
And then there were 11 Unixes.
Yes, and then there was 12, and then it keeps going on.
And then we have a next KCD cartoon.
Yes, of course. So does that mean that we're about to go to 13? No.
Who knows? I think Linux at this point has made it such that we won't have as many Unixes anymore.
Well, especially when you see Linux showing up in more and more interesting places, including on my Surface laptop now with the new WSL stuff, 2 stuff. It's like, anyway, we're here to talk about startups, not Microsoft.
Startups, right.
I still, though, it blows my mind that there's a Linux kernel in my Windows. It has to be said. So that importance or that connection to between startups and open source and being able to compose the pieces that are needed to build innovation. How do you see that importance change in reaction to what the world is going through right now? I mean, how does this accelerate things? How does it slow things down? How does it affect?
I think we end up with a space where, as much as open source is accepted and has won in some sense as a culture for development, the current pandemic crisis leads people to look to open source more for collaboration models, which I think is a really interesting way that this can affect the world today, in the sense that open source has for many, many years been working with the presumption that people are not working for the same company, are not in the same space. All of the decisions have to be made remotely and then documented and tracked in a way that is acceptable and interesting and accessible for historical record. Again, without the confines of the four walls of your office building, or even the virtual walls of your corporate ecosystem. And so I think what we see at the moment is we see companies learning a lot from open source development, but then also recognizing that in a time when we are all trying to make more and more changes in the world as rapidly as possible, that starting with the known open source building components and then adding value more quickly around those is going to be really the opportunity that is opened in this time. Making sure that you are not reinventing the wheel. The pressure and uncertainty of the economic situation today, the pandemic situation today, across the globe means that startups can have an opportunity to not necessarily try to find the perfect way to do something, but instead build from known building blocks, and then innovate faster in a world that right now needs a lot of innovation.
And boy, howdy, do we need a lot of innovation. So looking at the questions, Ty has a question. How would you start a conversation with a tech startup founder about open sourcing their solution, i.e., what's compelling, the pros, the cons, and especially, and I would add, the relationship between being a consumer of open source and then also being a contributor and doing all the right things?
My first question to every startup founder who says, I want to open source my project, or well, I want to open source what I'm working on, let's call it that, and make it an open source project. My first question is always, what do you expect from that open sourcing? Like, what is the strategy that you are executing that open source supports? Because open source isn't a strategy. It's a great way potentially to build a community. Not every community gets cohesion and grows, but it's a great way to build a community. But open source is fundamentally a licensing model and a development model. So any startup founder that comes to me and says, I'm going to open source what we're working on, I really want to understand first what the big strategy is and how open source supports that. I hearken back to some of the early or late 90s and early 2000s .com boom business models where, yes, we're leaking money like a sieve and we've only got 6 weeks of runway, but it's really all about capturing eyeballs. Sometimes I think right now that, that startups in this last boom have gotten the idea that if only I put open source on it, the community will come. And then we will be huge and it will be great. And then we will be madly successful. But that feels a lot like the South Park episode where the underpants gnomes have the business model of collecting underpants. And then step 2 is not quite yet defined, but step 3 is profit, of course. So I always want to understand what the strategy is, how the startup believes in the future that they can monetize around this open source project, and then what they are expecting from the community. I know in large companies more than startups, but sometimes even in startups, one of the answers that I get back is, well, we'll have a community and we'll get all this free development. But that free development doesn't come without a cost of community engagement and community management. And it is very much like managing an external workforce over which you have no direct authority. and you can only manage through incentives and carrots to build your company and your product for you. And that makes it actually that much more complex. So being sure that you understand why you are open sourcing something and what you expect to gain from that is always my first question.
Very much so. I remember having so many discussions with people about, oh, open source is a great way to get free labor. And it's no, not so much. So to extend on that, another question from Ajith. This is the license question. What kind of license would you suggest for startups which are coming up with open source tools? Permissive, non-permissive, etc.
This also goes back immediately to the strategy. Like, how do you intend to monetize around this? So you have some standard monetization models, and I'm not going to hit all of them, but you have open core, which is not necessarily super well received by the open source devout, but open core is a possible model. You have a software as a service model. I'm going to make everything free, but I'm going to run a service, and my service will be better than anyone else's service. And that has moats for other peer companies from competing with you, but it has almost no moat for the big corporate clouds to compete against you. So you would really want to look toward that as a potential partnership. Are you open sourcing this only as a recruiting strategy? And so you just want to be able to engage with the community and understand who's working on it, get to see them do work with you, understand how they fit with your company before you actually are hiring them? Or are there, other reasons that you are open sourcing? Because all of that also goes into permissive or non-permissive licenses. Generally, I prefer permissive licenses over non-permissive licenses, but startups have very different concerns, and this is a combination business strategy, corporate strategy, monetization strategy, community engagement strategy. All of these things go into a choice about licensing. Permissives are obviously the easiest to grow communities around, but you also have, you can build an entire ecosystem around that as well. And then you end up with companies that are being advocates for you if you have, say, something that has a very modular, pluggable system, or if you have non-permissive licenses, it's harder to build communities in some cases because some of them are so restrictive that you'll have other people not as inclined to contribute for particular reasons of licenses, but it does provide for you a bigger moat in some cases around what you're trying to do specifically and how to protect it from a business perspective. But again, I would say if you're not looking to participate and engage with open source deeply and broadly and invest in it, then there is actually no shame in making a proprietary product, and making a proprietary product can be a lot easier in many cases. So consider that and consider what you want out of open sourcing, as well as what license you want to pick in it.
Yeah, that's such a better considered answer than my answer, which is always just use the Apache license. Yeah, full stop.
Oh, see, and I'll say MIT.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, you're right. MIT. Now that squares in with another question coming in. How does IP and monetization square with the concept of open source? And this really taps into what you were just talking about at the end of your answer, but maybe you can go a little bit further with that.
Sure, happy to. So there are many, many different ways that monetization fits with the open source community. I've talked for years about the groups that I think about in open source. You have open source dogmatists, and this fits the Free Software Foundation. This fits a lot of the MIT or BSD licenses sort of fit in this space. The open needs to be open for open reasons because open is good. Free like freedom. And then there are open source pragmatists. And I think more and more now you run into pragmatists, especially as more and more businesses have started to do open source or contribute to open source. And so these are the people who use open source when it meets their business needs, who make proprietary solutions when it meets their business needs, engage with the community when it meets their business needs, develop their own communities when it meets their business needs, and then participate in a way that is very much about being pragmatic and practical about it. And then you have open source opportunists who are more interested in the buzz and goodwill of doing something in open source. And so one of my examples of that a long time ago was Cassandra, and how Facebook was like, we're kind of done with this tech, but it's really cool. Maybe you all want it, and kind of tossed it over the wall. And fortunately, there were some startups there that captured a lot of value out of that open source project, but built the community themselves and engaged with the community and developed a broader Cassandra community. And that so that would be an opportunist. So I think it is very acceptable to be in the pragmatist and the dogmatist space right now. Less so maybe the dogmatists, but that really depends. I mean, you need to obviously live to your own values, and the open source definition is a great set of values to look to around software. But I think pragmatism is very accepted now. So there are these more accepted business models around open source. There are accepted reasons to build open source and build in the open, and then say release proprietary binaries. So you have that no one can reuse your binary, but they could go compile it themselves if they wanted to. And so there is an acceptance of needing to pay our rent. Most, I would argue, countries in the world do not have a way for their citizens to pay their own rent or their own mortgages or feed their kids without earning some income. And within open source, that earning is certainly accepted as a need for people who are contributing to projects. And big companies now are actually placing people in projects as well, with a big company salary behind them in order to make sure that the open source project is happy and healthy. Startups, of course, it's a much harder sell to say, I want these 3 or 5 or 10 people to work on something which I don't have a direct monetization strategy for. So that's why I always start with, what do you want out of that project and what do you want out of that community, to decide if it's worth that investment at this stage, because that's another question for startups. Where I am today or where I am in a month or 3 months may be very different from where I will be in a year, and whether or not open source is appropriate at that point in time.
Indeed. I mean, there's so many different ways to look at it. We have a question that came in saying, why should I care about open source if I can consume it all day long? Why does making my stuff open source, or why does open source matter? And that what you're getting at with your answer really is, I mean, it leans sort of the pragmatic, obviously, but it really is, open source is there to be taken and used, and how you participate and how you give back, that's up to you. Right, that's up to you and your business models, and how everything goes together for what your needs are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much.
Another question: how can a startup based on open source be as disruptive as a startup based on closed source code? I.e., this is the argument of, I have to keep my secrets or I give them out.
Yep. So there are 2 great answers to this, and I'll try and hit them both in our time. One is ideas our ideas are everywhere. When 10 years ago, 20 years ago, in the first dot-com boom, 20 years ago, wow. 20 years ago in the first dot-com boom, everyone thought that their idea was the hard part. You know, like, I have to come up with the perfect idea. And then if I have that perfect idea, you know, the rainbows and magic will happen. And I think we've learned over the last 20 years that there are ideas, good ideas, interesting ideas are a dime a dozen, and they're going to be multiple people pursuing adjacent or even identical ideas at almost any point in time. But the execution is the hard part. So, so keeping your idea secret is not, in my opinion, nearly as important as being really good at executing and being clear about why you're doing things and making good choices doing them. The second answer is one that I have, is a conversation I have with startups and enterprises all the time, which is disruption is often seen as the big surprise in a lot of cases. And that is really hard to do in open source because you're developing everything in open source. When I worked at Nginx, because I worked at Nginx as one of those startups that I worked with, when I worked at Nginx, there was this great tension between the marketing team who was like, how are we gonna, you know, when are we gonna drop that release and what is the big press push gonna be about it? And I'm like, anyone who has been following our repos knows that we cut the release 2 weeks ago and we're running it through testing. So any day now, something is going to come out. So there's no big surprise in open source. And I would argue more often than not that within open source, because there's no surprise like a big new product announcement because you've been working in the open, that you actually have more time to develop your community to advocate for you and have a groundswell of engagement, as opposed to having to have one big surprise thing that the press has to go pick up on. So I'm a big fan of the sort of slow and steady dribble of information and excitement from people who aren't the company that's building this product or this project, as opposed to the big whiz-bang introduction on a keynote stage or with a big press release of, you know, our N.0 release with all these new shiny features.
Yeah, the marketing by press release is seductive in some ways, but it's not the end all and be all for this. So almost out of time. I mean, we could go on for hours this way, but
we could.
We're in a schedule, and there's a whole big conference happening around us, which is hard to believe. But let me ask you one last question. What advice would you give to a developer interested in startups right now, especially one that, you know, has interest in open source or in some of the open source projects? What's the one big piece of advice you could give, especially now?
Yeah. Especially now, I would give the same advice, but I would say it's especially important now, which is understand the bigger strategy, understand where the company that you are potentially looking at or considering building, understand where you want to be. Think in terms of vision and values and what you're giving to open source or getting from open source as part of this business strategy discussion. And always ask more questions. So if something sounds, you know, for business reasons we need to do a thing, well, that's great, but what are those business reasons? Why is that important? Technologists for many years have at some level been able to say, the business is somebody else's problem to run. But as you are looking to join or start something today, especially in uncertain economic times, knowing what that big business vision is and how that fits with the customer base that you're looking to reach out to or engage with, and how that is something that you can support as an individual in that organization, that is incredibly important. And that is what allows for big disruptive ideas to come forward, especially in times of hardship.
Great answer. And thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing some time this morning or this afternoon or this evening or wherever it is for people in the world. And thanks to the people who joined in and have been sitting with us and asking questions in the chat. I had a almost completely different outline here in front of me, but about halfway through, the questions were great for helping shape where the conversation went. So thank you all very much, and have a great build.